This year, inflation is high. The Russian economy is close to recession, very little growth. As I mentioned, export revenues from all the commodities are reducing. That puts pressure on the balance of payments and also on the fiscal position. So, we need to, Putin says it. He thinks he's at war with us, right? We need to take advantage of the vulnerabilities as they present themselves from him, and we need to, double up on sanctions and secondary sanctions, etc.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we are joined by Timothy Ash, an economist and an associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House, and a senior sovereign strategist at RBC Blue Bay Asset Management in London. But Tim today joins us from Istanbul in Turkey. Tim, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. You could probably hear the call to Azan in the background, which is pretty wonderful. But anyway, great to be here.
It's a wonderful backdrop you've treated us to, but what I'm keen to talk about is someone else's visit today. That's Vladimir Putin, seemingly signing a new trade deal with Indian Premier Modi. What should we make of this deal, and should Ukraine and their allies be worried?
Well, it's a very interesting one. I mean, I can see why Putin wants to do it, right? Putin wants to suggest he's got options, and obviously the American pressure on India, and obviously we had the Lukoil Rosneft sanctions. He wants to portray an image of strength, and that Russia is not going to be pushed around by the Americans or the Europeans. I think for Modi also, it's kind of interesting. I mean, that could irritate the Americans. Obviously the Modi Trump relationship's been kind of a difficult one, or obviously the tariffs were pretty painful. Again, maybe Modi also thinks that playing hard to get, showing that he has options, etc. That's a risk. I think a bigger risk for Modi. Putin. Pretty desperate. He needs to really show that he's got friends elsewhere in the world. But I think for Modi, he's taken a bit of a risk, I would think here, on Trump's ego, right? How will Trump react to this? Maybe not very well.
And how crucial actually are Indian exports to the Russian economy at this point?
Well, it's not the exports. It's, Russia needs the revenues, the oil export revenues. India, historically, India wasn't a big importer of Russian energy, but when we had the oil price cap and Western sanctions, and obviously the diversion of oil away from Europe elsewhere in the world, India picked that up, and actually it was a big beneficiary. It got a lot of cut price Russian oil, big win for the Indian economy, saved them tens of billions of dollars. But then obviously the Trump administration cited that as one of the reasons why it levied pretty hefty tariffs on India. The message was you need to move away from Russia. Now, obviously, Modi is doing the opposite of that. I mean, Modi is signaling, I think, not only that he wants to continue to buy Russian energy, but he's also talking about buying Russian weapons. I mean, that's again a pretty aggressive stance from the Indian side. I mean, I guess I'm not sure that's a very clever response from India particularly. I mean, one big lesson from the war in Ukraine is what Russian variant kit has underperformed. I mean, NATO US standard has excelled in this war, right? So, and obviously India has its issues both with China and with Pakistan. Obviously it wants to buy defense kit, but I'm not sure Russia is a great place to be buying it from at this point in time.
And does the US and Ukraine's other Western allies, do they have the power to kind of stop this from going on? Are they in a place to put sanctions or anything like that on India, or is that not really an option at this point?
No, I think it is. I think the US signaled they could well do that. And actually Indian companies, some of the companies that have been importing Russian oil have been signaling that they are looking to move away from it. So it's kind of a little bit strange that we now have this very high profile meeting with the two leaders kind of saying, or certainly Modi saying something quite different. I don't know how that will go down in the White House or particularly in Europe, actually.
Yeah, and what is the state of Russia's energy export industry at the moment as well? I mean, it has taken a dip, not just because of sanctions, but because of this ongoing Ukrainian deep strike campaign.
Yeah, look, as we've discussed in some detail, in the period in the run-up to just after the full-scale invasion, global markets were shocked by what happened. Oil prices increased significantly. Russia was a big beneficiary. We saw a big spike in export revenues to Russia from oil and energy. And actually, then sanctions are beginning to bite, right? And also global energy prices have moderated, right? I mean, oil's $60 a barrel thereabouts. And then we had the Trump administration came in. Obviously the Rosneft Lukoil sanctions, etc. And then a reduced oil price cap from the Europeans. We're now seeing Urals trading at a significant discount to Brent, etc. So the Russians are now struggling, actually. I mean, I think they are beginning to get into a bit of difficulty. A significant drop in oil and energy and commodity export revenues in general. I mean, that's good news for those who want to make sure Russia has less resources to feed it to it's the rebuild of its military industrial complex. I mean, my sense is, the Russian economy is increasingly vulnerable. Yeah, I mean, it's been very durable for almost 3-4 years of the war, but there are just signs that wheels are, could well be coming off, and it's a great time, I think, now for the West to push on with its advantage and tighten sanctions, focus on secondary sanctions. Again, that reduction in the oil price cap was pretty significant, and I think, in response to the India Putin meeting and the Indian suggestion or Modi's suggestion that they want to buy energy long term. Again, I think the West should signal that that's a mistake from the Modi administration and that its companies in India are at risk of secondary sanctions. Obviously, there's been frustration around the peace process. Putin doesn't seem very serious about it. Looks like he's playing for a long war. We need to increase the costs to Putin of that war, both in terms of increasing military supplies to the Ukrainians, so increase the cost on the battlefield to Russia, but at the same time, tighten the screws around the Russian economy, right? I mean, this year, inflation is high. The Russian economy is close to recession, very little growth. As I mentioned, export revenues from oil and commodities are reducing. That puts pressure on the balance of payments and also on the fiscal position. So, we need to, Putin says it. He thinks he's at war with us, right? We need to take advantage of the vulnerabilities as they present themselves from him. And we need to, double up on sanctions and secondary sanctions, etc.
And of course, Ukraine are pushing ahead, as you say, as you'd expect them to. I mean, we've seen strikes this week on sort of shadow fleet and sanctioned Russian-operated vessels in the Black Sea. How much damage can Ukraine inflict doing these direct strikes that are now expanding not just on refineries and export ports, but to the ships themselves?
Yeah, well, those you mentioned the attack, they were quite interesting for a number of reasons. I mean, I guess one, the capability that, Ukraine proved able, with naval drones in particular, to hit, Russia-related vessels or shadow fleet vessels at long range. But actually, two kind of interesting features. One is some of the ships were hitting in Turkey's economic zone. Turkey wasn't too happy with that, actually. And also the other one was the Ukrainians hit one of the three moorings of the CPC, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium pipeline that comes into Novorossiysk. So this is Kazakh exports through Russia, and they hit one of the three moorings. Right now, again, the Kazakhs weren't very happy. Now, and Ukraine has been fairly careful with, countries that are either neutral or fairly supportive to limit the damage to those countries. I mean, I sense in a way that, the Ukrainians were unhappy here with the Witkoff peace process in Moscow. I think they wanted to signal to the broader community, particularly the Americans, that, Ukraine has the ability to hit global energy infrastructure and have global market impact if negotiations aren't going their way. I mean, that they have agency. I mean, a lot's been made, I guess, in recent weeks about this Witkoff process, and that he ends up with Kushner going to Moscow and the Ukrainians are kind of excluded. I think the message there to everyone was, look, Ukraine can't be excluded, right? We're not a captive kind of audience or captive kind of player, right? I mean, we have long-range strike capability. We know the vulnerabilities of Russia. We know the vulnerabilities of energy supply chains. If you're going to force a deal on us, there are things we can do also to change the global narrative. Like, we need to be listened to. So I wouldn't expect, I think the Ukrainians going forward will be more careful in terms of what they hit. I don't think, for example, they're going to take the second and third moorings out on the CBC. I mean, remember, this is, not Russian oil, it's Kazakh oil that has been exported to European markets. I mean, actually, Ukraine and Europe, we should want that. We should want more diversification away from Russia. But I think this is all about signaling from the Ukrainians, etc.
And you mentioned before about the challenging position that the Russian economy has ended up in, and some of the signals of that happening. How should we interpret the selling off of gold reserves that is going on at the moment? Is it a sign that sanctions are working? Just that struggling of the Russian economy? What is going on there?
Well, probably, what is clear, we've seen a really significant drop in oil and energy export receipts for Russia, right? Significantly. It's, running around half the level it was a year or so ago, right? So, that does mean that, the fiscal, well, the balance of payments trade position is weaker. Probably they're struggling in terms of reserve accumulation. Remember here that, the less they earn in export receipts, the less they can use to buy imports. And they need to buy stuff, right? I mean, they need to buy military tech, inputs for military tech. I mean, sustaining this war machine is really, really expensive, right? And we have an interest now, in Europe. I mean, we can debate how the Americans view the threat from Russia. I think it's absolutely crystal clear now that Europe views Russia now as an existential threat. We have an interest in making sure that Russia receives less export revenues to be used to fuel imports, to buy stuff that need to regenerate that military capability. Now, if they are selling at gold reserves, that means there are pressure points, right? It means that they are short of foreign currency and they need to generate some revenue to continue some of those purchases.
And speaking of foreign currency, there have been some sort of parallels drawn between this being done and Russia's need for Chinese yuan currency. What's the situation there? Does Russia have enough to keep buying things from China that it needs to carry on with its?
Well, needs must, and I think Russia will. It's guns versus butter story, right? I mean, in the end, they'll conserve, the non-essential goods, and they'll buy the military stuff. But there is a cost and a price for that, right? I mean, it just means that ordinary Russians will increasingly begin to feel the cost of this war, right? I mean, you mentioned earlier, some of the deep strikes by the Ukrainians, particularly in terms of refineries, and how that is tightening the noose around Russia. I mean, this is all about bringing the war home to ordinary Russians, making them understand that a cost and a price is being paid by themselves, right? I mean, we're seeing disruptions to petrol supplies, higher petrol prices, queues, all those kind of things because of those hits by Ukraine on their energy infrastructure. And again, things are only going to get more difficult the longer the war goes on. I mean, I think Putin likes to portray this image that, there's all this durability and they can survive a long war. Well, so far there was a lot of insulation or buffers built into the Russian economy. I've spoken about this a lot. Putin knew that what was going to happen, built foreign exchange reserves to record highs. Yes, we immobilized half of those reserves, but they still had over 300 billion. That goes a long way. They benefited in the short term because of the spike in energy prices. That helped them in terms of the current account and trade positions, went into surplus, allowed them to fund the war. Now things are getting more difficult. They're drawing down their foreign currency reserves. They're running much smaller trade surpluses and current account surpluses. And again, it means that ultimately hard decisions will have to be taken and life will get more difficult for ordinary Russians, I would imagine. And eventually I think that will weigh on Putin. And again, we have an ability to make life much more difficult. We need to be more ambitious in what we're doing around the sanctions piece. Obviously, a lot of focus this week on the immobilized Russian asset issue. Again, take the money away from Russia, give it to Ukraine, enable it to sustain its war effort for longer and help it buy equipment to defend itself and ourselves.
Well, yes, and speaking of those frozen Russian assets, it's again being debated. The EU seems to be saying now that it is going to have a vote on its plan to loan Ukraine money backed by those assets. Can you just remind us of what this plan is, and how close do you think it is to finally becoming reality?
Yeah, okay, so it's something we've spoken about quite a lot in the past, right? $330 billion of Russian central bank reserves sat in bank accounts in Europe, Japan, UK, America, right? Doing nothing. This is Russian taxpayer money, right? Let's not beat around the bush. And the reality. I mean, now the harsh reality is that the war looks like it's going to extend longer. The Americans are pulling back from financing. We know the cost of the war is about $100 billion a year. With the Americans pulling back, that means Europe basically has to fill the gap. In the end, many European countries in terms of including the UK, right? I mean, how do we fill that gap? We have problems at home. Obviously, Rachel Reeves with the budget recently. I mean, how do we stump up more cash to fill this gap? Now, the EU and the IMF have suggested that the financing gap for 26 and 27 for Ukraine is 140 billion euros. That's budget and military support. And then actually the longer term, just budget requirement stated by the IMF is $140 billion for the period to 29, right? So there's this massive gap. Europe has no money. How are we going to fill it? If we don't fill it, Ukraine loses, and then the cost to Europe are much larger. So anyway, there's been a realization, a dawning of reality in Europe that actually it makes sense. Why should our taxpayers be paying for the war of Russian aggression when there's all this money sat in our bank accounts or bank accounts in the West? So anyway, lots of different thoughts about it. You could seize the assets. That's my preferred option. I think it would send a very strong signal to the Putin regime that breaking international law is not a great idea. Anyway, that's been pushed back on, concerns about property rights, all those kind of things. Anyway, they come up with this kind of clever tool called a reparation loan. Basically, Russian assets are not seized; they're repurposed cleverly to fund essentially a loan to Ukraine. Now the problem is a lot of these assets are in Belgium. Belgium's big concern that there are a lot. What happens if the underlying asset what happens if Western sanctions lapse or we fail? In Europe, there's a 6-month rollover of sanctions on Russia. What happens if the Hungarians block that? Russia gets the money back. Then we have a hole in. There's a depository called Euroclear that holds these assets. If sanctions aren't rolled over, Belgium would have to repay the assets. What happens? There's a very low probability of that. That's the reality. Russia hasn't launched a lawsuit after 3.5 years since mobilization. It's very unlikely to do that. But anyway, there is a risk of that. But there are solutions. The solutions are we share the liability, we share the risk. All European countries, the UK also has a role in this. We say, well, okay, Belgium, in a worst case scenario, if we're forced to give these assets back, we will cover any potential shortfall. We'll help cover this potential shortfall, right? So that's a solution. Will it happen? There is no alternative. I mean, that's the reality. I mean, the choices for Europe are this, including the UK. If we don't provide this funding, this $140 billion shortfall that I mentioned for 26, 27, Ukraine loses the war, right? What are the implications of that? Tens of millions of Ukrainians will move west. Massive political and social pressures. Obviously, anti-immigration feeling is fairly strong. It'll just fan far right and populist movements across Europe. Remember, we'll have Russia on our doorsteps, really. I mean, the two biggest military industrial complexes in Europe are now Russia and Ukraine. Russia will capture Ukraine's huge threat. We'll have to massively increase defense spending, from 2 to 5% of GDP. What does that mean? Increased budget deficits, increased borrowing requirements, higher interest rates, lower growth, and actually weaker currencies, right? So that's if we don't do it. And the alternative is, well, let's continue spending taxpayer money to fund it. And I think there's just no scope to continue to do that, right? I mean, take the UK. Our current funding envelope for Ukraine, I think, is about $5 billion a year for the next 5 years. $4 billion military, $1 billion budget support. We'll probably have to double that to help Europe meet this shortfall. Is there really another 5 billion quid a year available for the UK to do. I just don't see it, right? And again, from a basic, right and wrong perspective, why should our taxpayer money, someone's agreeing with me in the background there, why should our taxpayer money be used to help defend Ukraine and Europe against Russian aggression, while we're protecting Russian taxpayer money sat doing nothing in our bank accounts? In the UK, we have £25 billion sat in UK bank accounts of the Russian taxpayer. It's insane. It's absolutely insane that we're, again, spending £5 billion a year supporting Ukraine while we're defending Russia's money. Russia is the aggressor, absolutely. It's threatening our interests. We should make Russia pay. So we just need to get this done. Now, I think the Germans have kind of realized, Belgium's pushing back on this. But the harsh reality is, in the end, it's the German taxpayer will end up on the line. And I think Chancellor Merz has been pretty outspoken in support of this reparation loan idea. Actually, the German head of the European Commission, van der Leyen, is also very supportive. And he's off for dinner this evening to Belgium, Friday evening, to try and persuade the Belgian Prime Minister to roll over. I mean, in the end, the Belgians are one of the lowest contributors to European defence, right? I mean, they're kind of perennial underspenders in defence. This 2% of GDP defence spend. Belgium's got a terrible record. They're one of the lowest contributors in support of Ukraine, and they've actually been sitting on around €4 billion of profits on these immobilised Russian assets from 22 to 23. And yet, European security, the whole national security interests of the whole of Europe, are actually now almost been held hostage by Belgium, who is, as I said, taking a backseat in terms of European security and defence and supporting Ukraine. So I think it has to happen. It will happen, I think, ultimately, because the consequences of us not doing this are I just can't think we couldn't live with the consequences of this.
And Russia seem to be getting quite worried about this at this point, don't they? I mean, head of the Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, has said it would be an act of war, although admittedly, I think most things now that Europe do are an act of war, according to Medvedev, but all the same. How big of a blow could this be for Putin and the people who surround him in the Kremlin?
Well, look, the assets were immobilized. When I say immobilized, I mean we imposed sanctions, which meant that these assets in our jurisdictions couldn't be moved. Right? People talk about freezing immobilization. I mean, they've not really been frozen; they've been immobilized. Right? Russia hasn't been able to use them, and that's been very painful. Right? I mean, you have foreign exchange reserves. Countries keep foreign exchange reserves. They want them readily available and liquid to help them in times of crisis. We pull these resources away from, Russia hasn't been able to use them for that purpose, right? And it was an act of war when it was done in April 22, and Russia didn't do anything, right? So, and as we've spoken, Russia has drawn plenty of red lines. Supply of MiG 29s, T-72s, HIMARS, UK Storm Shadow. In the end, they haven't done anything in response, right? They're not going to do anything in response to this particularly. They have very few options. But actually doing it sends a very strong signal that Ukraine is well funded for the next couple of years, that they can use that money to buy US weapons, keep Trump on side, stay in the war, and ensure our security. And I think, again, it sends a very strong signal to Russia that there are consequences of bad actions. You invade a country, you break international law, you commit war crimes, you pay a price, right? And, people say, well, what about other similar regimes? Won't they pull their assets out of our jurisdiction? Well, so far they haven't. Again, this is for 3.5 years these assets have been immobilized. There was no evidence of any of these countries pulling any resources out of Western reserve currencies. And actually, I think it sends a very strong signal. Personally, I mean, if you're China and you're planning to invade another country, commit war crimes, and do some bad things generally, your assets are at risk. Maybe it will persuade those countries to behave a bit better, right? I mean, so I think on all levels, this just makes sense.
Well, Timothy Ash, hopefully the next time we speak then, it might be about these assets being put to use by Europe, but we'll see how it develops. Timothy Ash, economist and associate in the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, or you can also sign up for a membership where you'll get exclusive content and access to videos earlier than you would otherwise. And remember, for the latest news and analysis, you can read The Times at thetimes.com, or you can listen to Times Radio. And if you want to hear more from Frontline, you can also hear us in podcast form. Just look for Times Radio's Frontline wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks very much. Goodbye.